Welcome to the Explainer. Our brains run on this incredibly complex communication system, a sort of biological operating system that controls literally everything we do. But what happens when that system gets hacked? Today, we're diving into how drugs can actually hijack your brain, turning its own processes against it. So let's just start with this idea right here. What if drugs could hack your brain just like a computer? Now, I know it sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but honestly, it's a surprisingly accurate way to think about what's going on. We're going to break down exactly how this hijacking happens, piece by piece. Okay, so first things first. To really understand the hack, we have to understand the system it's targeting, right? So let's take a quick look at your brain's normal, everyday operating system. I want you to think of your brain as this like 3-pound supercomputer. It's not built with silicon chips, of course. It's made of billions and billions of specialized cells called neurons. And these neurons are all connected, forming these unbelievably complex circuits and networks that control everything you think, everything you feel, and everything you do. So, how do all these neurons talk to each other? Well, it's actually this beautiful, really elegant process. See, one neuron sends an electrical signal, and when that signal hits the end of the line, it releases these chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These little chemicals float across a tiny gap and fit perfectly into receptors on the next neuron, kind of like a key in a lock. And boom, the message is passed along. Then, to finish the job, special molecules called transporters come in and recycle those leftover neurotransmitters, which officially ends the signal. It's clean, it's efficient, and it is a perfectly balanced system. But what happens when some outside substance gets into that perfectly balanced system? This right here is where the hack begins. This is the disruption of that entire network. And drugs, they tend to use two main hacking strategies. On the one hand, some drugs, like heroin, are basically master impersonators. Their chemical structure is so similar to our natural neurotransmitters that they can fool the receptors, unlock them, and then start sending all sorts of abnormal messages through the system. Then you have the other kinds of drugs, like cocaine, that act more like saboteurs. They don't impersonate anything. Instead, they just block those transporter molecules from doing their cleanup job. And this causes a massive flood of natural neurotransmitters, completely overwhelming the system and amplifying the signal way, way beyond any normal level. So these hacks, they don't just happen randomly all over the brain. No, they target specific, really critical areas. Let's take a look at the three main zones that come under attack. First up is the reward circuit, or what's technically known as the basal ganglia. You can think of this as the brain's pleasure and habit center. It's the part that gives you that great feeling when you eat delicious food or just hang out with your friends. Well, drugs target this area and just crank the volume all the way up to 11, producing this intense euphoria, or high. The problem is, with repeated use, the circuit starts to adapt. It literally turns down its own sensitivity. And pretty soon, normal pleasures, they barely even register. The only thing that feels good anymore is the drug. Next, drugs go after the alarm center, the amygdala. This part is responsible for those feelings of stress and anxiety and irritability. And when a drug's high starts to fade, this circuit kicks into overdrive, creating those absolutely miserable feelings of withdrawal. This just creates a vicious cycle, because with repeated drug use, the alarm center gets more and more sensitive. Eventually, a person isn't even using the drug to feel good anymore. They're just using it to get a little bit of temporary relief from feeling awful. And finally, there's the brain's CEO, the prefrontal cortex. This is our hub for planning, for making decisions, and for self-control. And what is so critical to understand here is that this is the very last part of the brain to mature, which makes teenagers uniquely vulnerable to this whole hack. Drugs just throw the prefrontal cortex completely out of whack, short-circuiting impulse control and rational thought. Suddenly, the CEO is no longer in charge. The compulsions driven by those hijacked reward and stress circuits, they take over. Okay, let's make this a little more concrete. How do these hacks actually play out with specific drugs? Let's open up a few case files. Let's take opioids. We're talking about things like heroin or prescription painkillers. These are the mimics. They attach to opioid receptors all over the brain and body, and they do two things. They block pain signals, and at the exact same time, they trigger that massive release of dopamine in the reward circuit we just talked about. And that 1-2 punch is what makes them so incredibly reinforcing. Now, let's look at a totally different strategy, cocaine. As a powerful stimulant, it doesn't mimic a thing. Nope. It goes for the flooding hack. It physically blocks the transporters that are supposed to be recycling dopamine. So, with nowhere to go, dopamine just floods the synapse, continuously stimulating the next neuron over and over and over, creating that intense, reinforcing high. And what about nicotine, especially with the crazy rise of vaping? I mean, look at these numbers from 2019. They're alarming. Over a quarter of 12th graders reported vaping in the past month. And here's why nicotine is so powerfully addictive. It activates the very same reward circuits in the brain as heroin and cocaine. It reinforces that behavior every single time. So, the big question is, how does this repeated hacking of the system lead to the long-term changes that we call addiction? Let's trace that path from start to finish. It all starts with that first dopamine flood, that feeling of euphoria. But here's the thing, your brain is an adaptation machine. So, in response to being constantly overstimulated, it dials down its own dopamine sensitivity. That's tolerance. Now, you need more of the drug just to feel normal. And as tolerance builds, those stress circuits become overactive, leading to withdrawal whenever the drug isn't around. Eventually, the brain's very structure and function have changed. The hijack system is now running the show, driving compulsive use no matter what the devastating consequences might be. And this really is the most important takeaway from all of this. The science shows us, unequivocally, that addiction isn't a weakness of character. It is not a moral failing. It's a chronic brain disease, and it's defined by fundamental physical changes to the brain's wiring, changes that literally hijack a person's ability to choose freely. And that science, it leaves us with a really profound question. If addiction is a disease of a hijacked and rewired brain, well, how should that change our response to it? How does that reframe everything from treatment to policy to just simple compassion? That's the real-world implication of understanding this hack. Thanks for joining The Explainer.